If you remember, monopolistic competition is perhaps a slightly more realistic industry form, and it represents an industry where there are lots and lots of providers of the good, or in particular service, who are trying to compete on the basis of non-price differentiation. So they're trying to produce a quality that distinguishes the product that they sell in order to capture some market share. We say that there are a lack of barriers to entry and exit, which mean that the abnormal profit which can be gained acts as a signal to other firms to enter and compete for market share in order to capture abnormal profit. And this means that these kinds of organisations are constantly trying to re-differentiate themselves in order to maintain market share and abnormal profit. And we may think that this brings with it certain benefits for the consumer in terms of alternative providers of the good or service, which mean that they have a breadth of choice. So when we start to depict the industry, we can think back to the algebra that we looked at when we were constructing demand and marginal revenue curves for a monopolist. So here we'll do some simple calculus, which is to say the demand function is given by price is equal to m minus 2q. Well, remember that revenue is equal to price times quantity. So in this case, q times m minus 2q would simplify to qm minus 2q squared. If we differentiate this, divide it through by q in order to find the slope of marginal revenue, our marginal revenue slope will be m minus 4q. So our intersection here is m. This is the slope of the demand curve, which is given by minus 2q. And when we put in marginal revenue, we'll find that the slope of that will be minus 4q. In order to find equilibrium, we follow our usual step, which is to say, if this is our marginal revenue function, we need to add in marginal cost. So marginal cost taking the usual tick shape, we find equilibrium output. So Q star for this individual producer. Again, we have to extrapolate up because we've got a downward sloped demand curve to find the equilibrium price. So moving horizontally along from where we've intersected the demand curve, we find the equilibrium price for this particular producer. So equilibrium output, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Extrapolate up to the demand curve to find the equilibrium price. To identify whether there are abnormal profits and how sizable the abnormal profits are, we need to add in our average cost function. So we've added in the average cost function, remembering its lowest point is where it intersects marginal cost. The area between P star, our equilibrium price, and the average cost function gives us abnormal profit. So the abnormal profit which accrues by virtue of the fact that a monopolistically competitive firm sets its own price. It doesn't have to take the industry determined price. Now at this point we can make our normal analysis, which is to say, if it was a competitive market, then we would expect to see a greater level of output. Output would be at the intersection here of marginal cost and demand, and therefore we'd see a slightly lower price. However, although consumer surplus is squeezed, we have an enhanced producer surplus because of the limitation of quantity, and we have, as before, the triangle of deadweight loss. We need to ask ourselves, this industry is typified by small competing firms differentiating their product. The examples we talked about in lectures were hairdressers, cafes, book retailers, car repair shops. So businesses which are trying to offer different aspects of the good and service that they're providing in order to attract niches or segments of consumers. If we move to a perfectly competitive industry, then we're back to a scenario as before where output is higher, price is lower, we have no deadweight loss, but we're also facing a homogeneous product. So do we want to have differentiated goods and services which can appeal to us? And in terms of the hairdresser scenario we discussed, we explored what it was we were looking for. Some of us look for low price, some of us look for a pleasant atmosphere, some of us looked for add-on services such as nail bar and head massage, some of us look for the type of products that were available for dyeing and washing our hair. So if we move to a perfectly competitive market with homogeneous goods and services, we wouldn't enjoy any of this differentiation. So we can make the calculation about the difference in consumer surplus by adding in the equilibrium labels if we were in a perfectly competitive scenario. So instead of a consumer surplus which was MX P star under monopolistic competition, intervention in order to make this a welfare maximising model would mean we had consumer surplus of M price PWM, price welfare maximising E. So it's a minor gain in terms of welfare, but again it's reducing the choice. So we looked over here at the simplified algebra, which gave us the relationship between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. But we need to just remind ourselves of the conditions that mean a monopolistic competitive firm faces a shallower demand curve compared to a monopolist provider, which would be perhaps something like that. So remember the characteristics and the terminology, the economic language that we used when we looked at these types of businesses. And we talked very much in terms of rivalry between businesses and substitute and complementary products. Remember, we might be looking at cross-price elasticities when we're looking at firms in these types of sector. So if we think about that, the fact that there are always going to be substitute products, there is competition within these types of sectors, means that the demand curve is much shallower than that faced by the monopolist. The monopolist theoretically has no rivals, and therefore it can enjoy a profitable position long term, capturing those abnormal profits. The fact that there are no entry and exit barriers mean that not only does a monopolistically competitive provider face substitute products and competition within its sector, but there will be new entrants into the sector, so it's constantly having to differentiate itself, and this is what gives us the breadth of choice that we enjoy as consumers. So these were the three models that you might have to reproduce in a test or exam, and hopefully this has given you a slightly better understanding of how to construct the diagrams in terms of which lines go in first and the accuracy that is required to enable you to make your points relative to welfare maximising, for example, with the utmost clarity and success.